We've got people with us today. There's 60 people that registered for today's field tour, and from 8 different states, mostly on the West Coast, but also some folks from the East Coast. So thank you all for taking time to join our field tour today. This is our 5th field tour in a series of 9 field tours, and I know some of you have been with us for the previous ones. But for your information, there's a website linked there at the bottom where we're archiving all the previous field tours. So if you weren't able to attend those, you can access those recordings online. And I want to encourage everybody to use the chat box today to introduce yourself. And this will be a good place to put your questions, because at the end of today's field tour, we will have time with our presenters to go through those questions and answer them. And so with that, I just want to also acknowledge all of our sponsors. The Dry Farming Project really grew this year, and we have a number of projects happening this year, as you can tell from our field tour schedule. And tomatoes are a big part of that. So we're going to be learning about the tomato variety trials with Alex Stone and Matt Davis and Cassandra Waterman. And we have Steve Peters joining us to share about his tomato variety trial work as well in dry farm systems. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you, Alex.
All right. Oops. So my name is Alex Stone, and I'm the vegetable specialist at Oregon State University. And I started working with dry farm crops because of interacting with Amy Garrett about winter squash. So I've worked on dry farming of winter squash, but dry farming of tomatoes is pretty new to me and my group. But so we have been talking about our work with tomatoes in the first and second field tour, and then also in last week's field tour. So today what we're talking about is everyone's favorite conversation though, which is varieties, because they are so much fun. I did want to mention all the collaborators, and actually this might not even be all of them, on this project. So we have several speakers today, Matt Davis and Cassandra Waterman from our variety evaluation group, as well as Amy Garrett, who leads the overall dry farming initiative, and then also Steve Peters from Seed Revolution Now, who's one of our collaborators on this project. But I also wanted to mention that we have field experiments at Cameron Ridge Farm and Gathering Together Farm, and we are interacting with Loghouse Plants in our grafting project. And the Culinary Breeding Network and Lane Selman are working with us on this project on the sensory evaluation. Tanya Murray from Oregon Tilth is working on profitability analysis. And our major funder for this in a brand new 3-year grant is Western Sayre, and we thank them very much for that. So welcome to Dry Farm Tomato World. And as I said, this is one of a series of field tours about this project, and this one is focused on varieties. I want to really thank all of our tomato crew. We're growing more than 200 plots of tomatoes, and it's a huge amount of work. And here we were, this was taken on Monday, I think. This is everyone but me, because I was the photographer. And we've put in a lot of long days harvesting the tomatoes, and I just wanted to thank everybody. All right, so I mentioned that Western Sayre has funded this project. We just got funding starting on May 1st of this year for 3 years. The goal of this project essentially is to develop a profitable dry farm tomato production system for Oregon's Willamette Valley. And that the various components of that project are looking at soil and fertility management. And Matt Davis talked about that in Field Tour 2. Varieties, including grafting, which we're talking about today. We talked a little bit about grafting in the field tour last week. Pruning and staking, we talked about last week. Profitability analysis, we haven't even started this project, this part of the project with Tanya, but we're excited to start on that this winter with her. And then marketing, since we haven't even figured out what to market yet, we haven't gotten to that, but we'll be working, as I said before, with Lane Selman from the Culinary Breeding Network. So variety selection is really just one piece of the overall tomato production system. which includes site selection, which was discussed in Field Tour 1, so fertility management, Field Tour 2, today varieties, and then these two were talked about in the last field tour. But I just want to mention that, varieties are only productive within the context of all of these elements in a tomato production system. So we talked about examples of dry farm tomato production systems in last week's webinar. So go look at that webinar if you're interested in more information about that. But one of the systems we talked about was this dry farmed tomato system in the United States in coastal California. And that is based in this unique environment, a humid, cool coastal environment, a Mediterranean climate where it doesn't rain in the summer, but a pretty different temperature and humidity than what we have here in the Willamette Valley. And in that system, they are have focused in the past pretty exclusively on early girl tomatoes because of the amazing flavor that dry farmed early girls have in that environment. And so we have sort of started by learning about this system and looked at how we might adapt it to the Willamette Valley. But because it's so much hotter and drier here, what we find is what you see here, which is that early girl is fairly small in size and has a lot of blossom end rot. And this varies a lot from site to site, but nonetheless, even under the best circumstances of like 20 to 30% blossom end rot, that really makes early girl not a very likely candidate for a Willamette Valley dry farm system. So we're sort of starting this variety exploration with that in mind, that early girl doesn't seem to be working very well here, and that blossom end rot is a significant problem that we need to screen for. So Steve Peters from Seed Revolution Now is one of the partners in this Western SARE funded project, and he is going to talk now about his breeding program.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Okay, Seed Revolution Now, we're a small breeding and research and seed production company in Central California. And you'll see this first picture here is actually my coastal site in what Alex calls the cool Mediterranean. So this is similar to what where the early girl was grown. And as you can tell, it's a pretty nice place to work. But I also, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, I want to introduce the players, my cohorts here. This is my main cohort, Conti Rawal, who's 80 years young. The man still has spring in his step, and he's the primary breeder in our project. He's been involved in tomato breeding for about 40 years. Next. And then this is Beth Bersinski, who's my co-worker in the field, and without which I would never have gotten all this stuff done and planted and harvested. Next. Okay, so we've got 2 field sites specifically that we're growing tomatoes in, and one is in Gilroy, California, and you'll see the latitude here, 37 for both of them. And Gilroy's, this site's about 14 miles inland, and it's a silt loam, which is actually quite a good dry farm soil. And you'll see from the description that it's pretty deep and somewhat poorly drained. And you'll see what the average highs and lows are for the summer months, which may be somewhat similar to the Willamette Valley, although I suspect maybe a little hotter. I'm not sure. And then the other site is in, which I just told you there, it's in Pescadero, a coastal site, and you'll see the average temperatures are a lot cooler there. So let's go on to the next slide here. And so this project started 4 years ago, and it really just started in my inland site. And at the time, we weren't necessarily going to be dry farming this spot. And we really are trying to develop new tomatoes for the market And so we've been doing crossing for the last 4 years. And we originally started with hand pollination in the field. And the first year we started with we grew about 600 plants, about 35 varieties of heirlooms and commercials. And we started crossing them. And then we've been continuing to, then we added the Pescadero site in 18. And we've been continuing to do pollination work and evaluating our F1s and then the subsequent generations, the F2s and F3s. Next. Okay, so this is the inland site here. I just took this picture yesterday, in fact, and you'll see there's a row of lima beans in the middle, but to the left are several rows of irrigated tomatoes. And to the right, you'll see 2 rows of dry farm tomatoes, which were much smaller and didn't do as well this year. And I think I just learned some things. I missed the window. Maybe should have irrigated it once because we had an extremely dry winter. And so dry farming did not work nearly as well as it did last year. We had a much less stored moisture through the winter months. Next. And then this is my coastal site. And now in the inland site, were 5-foot row spacings. Here we're spacing the rows 7 feet apart. And the plants were much more robust. And we have we have most of these were much more robust than the inland dryland site. Next. Okay, so there's several characteristics we are looking at. I'm not going to go through all of these, but as you know, heirloom tomatoes have a lot of flaws, and we were really trying to improve them. And we've already seen a lot of improvement by using, for example, commercial processing tomatoes to increase yield and create firmer fruit. And also we're looking at a lot of fruit characteristic traits like blossom end rot and scarring. And we're seeing a lot of improvement just by making strategic crosses in the field. Next. This is some of the material that we grew. This was actually all dry farmed from our coastal site, but you see some of the range of the material that we're using. We really like the blue-black types, like indigo rose would represent that. Chocolate types like Cherokee purple, as well as tangerine, yellow, red, and pink, with varying sizes, shapes, and pleating and so forth. So we had a huge range of material we're working with. Next. This is Nick Madden, a soil scientist in California who came down to our Gilroy site, and he did a coring and put sensors. We put sensors in at 1, 2, 3, and 4 feet to measure this. And Nick thought that this was a great soil. It was silt loam or clay loam all the way down to 4 feet. Next. Now, this is a moisture reading. I know most of you probably don't know what kilopascals are, but this was the moisture readings through from the end of July until yesterday, 1, 2, 3, and 4 feet. And the higher the number, the drier the soil. So basically the surface was bone dry, and actually has been bone dry since the middle of May, which is, I think, why we had very small plants this year, because we put our transplants in and the roots were never able to reach the moisture, which was probably at that time down 18 inches. But you can see at 2 feet, the moisture is quite good. And in fact, it still isn't bad. I think 60, and Alex might be able to shine some light on it, but even that number is not bad for this time of year. Next. So this is the way in the Gilroy site, this is a crop of one of our plum tomatoes that's still this was a few days ago, so it's just starting to ripen now, but we haven't really gotten into our big yield season yet. Next. Okay, this is a red slicer that was dry farmed, and in fact, it was one of the better performers of the dry farmed tomatoes. We had about 40 fruits per plant on this particular one, which compared to the irrigated varieties the same variety was about 50 fruits per plant. So we're losing about 10 to 20% in numbers, but still we've got pretty decent size. So next. And lo and behold, we're actually not getting any blossom end rot, even though the plants are small, and it's, you can see that it's quite dry, but I think maybe part of that is due to the fact that the yields, the fruit load wasn't as heavy. And I think when you have a heavy fruit load, you're going to see more blossom end rot. But in contrast to the coastal site, interestingly enough, that has substantial amount of blossom end rot. But the exciting thing about that is that some of the F1 hybrids and some of the F2s and F3s are not exhibiting any blossom end rot, even though the original varieties have quite a bit of blossom end rot. So I think we've got a lot of material to work with, and I'm really hoping we can get some of that material up to Oregon and start to see what it can do up there. And anyway, so that's all I'm going to say for now. But yeah, please ask some questions, and I'm happy to help. And it's been a real fun project, and so thanks, folks.
Great. So we're going to have questions at the end.
Okay.
All right. So we're very excited to have Steve working with us down in California. But now we're going to talk about the OSU trial. So we weren't funded until, we didn't hear that we were funded until, March of this year. So it was quite a scramble. We had been collecting varieties to trial, hoping that we were funded, but we didn't do a huge extensive search because we weren't certain if we would be funded. But where did we look for germplasm for this project? So we have been working with dry farmers in the Willamette Valley, and so we used varieties that they have been growing, for example, Big Beef and Teardrop, and we'll hear about Teardrop later. Adaptive Seeds is a regional seed company, and they have a huge tomato collection, and we bought from them their mid-sized tomato collection, and they have been selecting for blossom end rot resistance, and we see that in our work with their germplasm. We have tomatoes from Steve Peters at Seed Revolution Now, Experimental Farm Network, and other small seed companies and independent breeders. We are trialing favorite tomatoes grown with irrigation of our partner farmers. We have some classic, very historic tomato from Italy, the Pianolo tomatoes. We met a woman from Spain who works with gardeners and small farmers in the Barcelona area, and got some germplasm from her. We think that cherry and small tomatoes are more resistant to blossom end rot, so we accessed small and cherry tomatoes. We searched for tomatoes with known blossom end rot resistance, and then also we sourced tomatoes from the Dwarf Tomato Project because I just recently heard about that project. So in the end, this is the list of sources for all of our germplasm this year. Now that we have more time to find germplasm for next year, we'll be looking at additional sources, including working with USDA GRIN and a more extensive list of sources. But we have quite a diversity of tomatoes out there. So I did want to just tell you a little bit about the Dwarf Tomato Project, about which I know, next to nothing, besides we are now growing some of their tomatoes. But this is a really interesting sort of citizen plant breeding project in both hemispheres. You can read more about it at the websites. There's two, one in North America and one in one in the northern hemisphere and one in the southern hemisphere to read about. But here's a little bit of history about it. So the goal of this project is to develop dwarf plants that produce tomatoes with the complex flavors and fruit size of indeterminate tomato varieties. That's what they say they're doing. And these are typically, they're not determinate tomatoes, they're dwarf indeterminate tomatoes. And how this all came about is that the project is managed by Craig LeHoulier in the United States and Patrina Nusk-Small in Australia. And they met through tomato chat websites for people. They describe themselves as extreme tomato enthusiasts. And they decided that they wanted to create new dwarf tomatoes. And Craig had read about this, an old dwarf tomato called New Big Dwarf. And in the seed catalog, it said where it was derived from, which was from a cross of a known medium-sized pink-fruited dwarf called Dwarf Champion that had been around since the 1800s. And they crossed that with a really large tomato, Ponderosa. And then through that cross, they selected New Big Dwarf. But then there was not much work creating dwarf tomatoes after that. So Craig and Patrina decided to work together across the hemispheres to get volunteers to help them create new dwarf tomato plants. And so you can read more about that at the websites. But they started growing out the first crosses in 2006, and now there's more than 100 varieties available. And this is an entirely volunteer project, and their goal is to make these available at the lowest possible cost to gardeners and farmers. And this is just a picture from our field trial of one of these plants, and you can see how dwarf that and somewhat upright that tomato is. So in our screening trial, we have about 200 plots, and they're both varieties and scion rootstock combinations of grafted plants, and Matt's going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. There's 5 plants in a plot, 15 square feet per plant. We planted them as early as we could in May. We are not staking them. We are allowing them to sprawl, and we harvest the tomatoes weekly, which really isn't, you know, commercial farmers would harvest more often than that, but that's as much as we can do to get all of this stuff out of the field. Originally, we were taking yield data on all 5 plants. We're now taking them from 3 plants in the plot. And our focus really is on blossom end rot resistance, but we take yield data, fruit size data, fruit number. We look for blemishing of all kinds with a focus on both light and heavy blossom end rot and sunburn. I did want to mention that this is located in Corvallis, Oregon on a very good dry farm soil, Chehalis silt loam, which is a deep silt loam typical of these really great soils in the Willamette Valley. So I just wanted to reiterate that, you know, blossom end rot is this big problem. This is heavy blossom end rot in which the tomatoes subsequently rot. These tomatoes, you can't see it very well in this picture, have light sort of superficial blossom end rot, which could be used by, you know, in a restaurant or made into a dry as a dry tomato or something. So they actually still have market value, but these really do not. But what we're of course looking for are unblemished fruit. So as we sort of started out, we were thinking about, you know, what is the conventional wisdom about different kinds of tomatoes? And there are so many different kinds of tomatoes, and what is their relative susceptibility to blossom end rot? And small round tomatoes are considered to be resistant versus these elongated tomatoes like this, like a paste tomato, is considered to be extremely susceptible to blossom end rot, and many gardeners can vouch for that. And then as size increases, what we think is that tomatoes become more and more susceptible. So a really large beefsteak tomato, we would imagine, would be very susceptible. The good news is that we are finding that we are finding varieties, at least in this first season of trialing, that are resistant in all these tomato types. So now we're going to talk type by type, and we're going to have a few different speakers talk about that. But first, actually, we're going to watch a, whoops. It's not playing. Let's see. If we go here. We are going to, whoops.
My name is Cassandra Waterman. I am a student research assistant here.
I'm sorry, for some reason this isn't playing in full screen, so we're just going to watch it like this.
My name is Cassandra Waterman. I am a student research assistant here with the Dry Farm Project. We're here at the Veg Research Farm in Corvallis, Oregon. Here we have our tomato variety trial. We're trialing over 200 varieties to look at dry farm performance, and the most important being blossom end rot resistance under dry farm conditions. Each variety has 5 plants within a plot, and there are no replications. Around the entire experiment, there are border plants to prevent any edge effect from the experiment. They were planted in early May. Come with me on a tomato tour. So here we have a Brandywine cherry. These plants, we haven't harvested in a while because we determined that they look really good. They don't have any blossom end rot. They've been extremely prolific, and here we've flagged them just to keep an eye on their progress, but so far no blossom end rot. Here we have Golden Nugget, a cherry tomato that is holding really nicely. We haven't harvested these in 2 weeks. They have been the most prolific cherry tomato in our trial, and they are so beautiful. No blossom end rot. And so early. Here we have a dwarf variety. These have a more compact growth habit, so they're really nice. They would not need to be staked. This here is called the Dwarf Beauty King, and I'm going to show you why. Maybe. Look at that guy. They have these beautiful stripes. There is some cap facing, which is pretty typical of an heirloom type variety, but these have been performing really well so far. So here we have California's classic dry farm tomato, the Early Girl. These do really well under dry farm conditions in coastal California, but here in the Willamette Valley, they're highly susceptible to blossom end rot. This is one of the reasons that we are doing this variety trial, is to determine which varieties or rootstocks have higher blossom end rot resistance. So these monstrous plants here are Early Girls grafted onto a Maxi Fort rootstock. They're more vigorous and show signs of less blossom end rot compared to an early girl that's ungrafted. Here we have this variety is called Pailu KS. They're really beautiful and grow on these vines much like you would find in a grocery store, so we can just harvest this whole vine. They don't have any blossom end rot, and this is something that we're seeing across the trials. The smaller tomatoes are less susceptible to blossom end rot. Here we have sun golds. These prolific plants just keep putting on beautiful classic cherry tomatoes. This is the standard, and they are doing so well in this trial. Yum. Here we have a Zoichka, which is an heirloom variety, and it is performing so well. They're these beautiful yellow golden heirlooms. We see little to no blossom end rot in this variety, which is amazing because they can be really big. Just gonna cut into it and show you. It's full of water, so juicy, dry farmed. Dan?
Great. And many thanks to Matt Davis, who made that video. He was the videographer and producer. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Matt to talk about cherry tomatoes.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Matt Davis, and I'm a research assistant on the project. So one of the variety groups that we're looking into are these cherry tomatoes, and we're really happy to report that so far in our trial, we've seen no blossom end rot in cherry tomatoes, or at least very little. So that kind of confirms the prediction that we made at the beginning of the season that cherry tomatoes would not have a lot of blossom end rot. Here on the left, we have sun gold, really prolific, doing a lot. And then on the right, I believe this is Galapagos, which is a wild cherry tomato type. Next. And then another one of our favorite cherry tomatoes that Steve Peters gave to us is this Brandywine cherry tomato. Super delicious, super early, highly productive. So if any of you are interested in trying out dry farming for the first time and you want a success, if you want to win, that is, I would highly recommend cherry tomatoes. They do really well. So yeah, that's it.
All right, now Cassandra's going to talk about small tomatoes.
Hi everyone. So this little small round tomato is called Red Racer. We got these seeds from High Mowing Seeds. And like I said in the video, we're seeing that smaller round tomatoes are showing less signs of blossom end rot, and this variety isn't showing any signs. They've been super high yielding, and they have a really great flavor. Oh, next. Here's another small tomato called Rosa di Benevento. We got these seeds from Portland Seed House. In the picture, they look really red, but in person, they actually have this really rosy matte finish to them, and we're seeing no blossom end rot. They have high vitamin C, and the flavor is almost like a tropical fruit. Next. Azoichka. I think this has become a crew favorite for all of us. Marco said so in the chat. He was the first one to harvest it and bring our attention to it. They're large, beautiful fruit and have little to no blossom end rot that we've seen so far. And their taste is really mellow. They have a really nice texture and are juicy. They're also a lot earlier than most beefsteak types. So this is a really great candidate for dry farming, at least in what we're seeing so far.
Yeah, and Adaptive Seeds says it wins their informal tomato of the year award regularly, which says a lot because they have a lot of tomatoes.
And then Alex talked a little bit about the dwarf tomato project. We saw Dwarf Beauty King in the video. This is another dwarf variety. These have really large fruit, and their color is that orange and pink striped. They're really meaty, and if you were to just see them at the market, you wouldn't think that they're growing on these compact small plants. They're really nice to harvest. They're easy to get around, and we haven't seen a need for staking.
Yeah, they're amazing. All right, so I'm going to talk about red slicers, which is, you know, for many consumers, the kind of tomato they seem to want the most. We have, and the other thing that I just want to say about all of our conversation about our varieties, that we are right in the middle of tomato harvest season. And so we are sort of just overwhelmed by all of the tomatoes and all of the data we're collecting. And so when we talk about varieties that are doing well, it's not to say that there are not many others that are also not doing well, but these are some of the ones that have stood out to us as we have harvested and processed them. And so in terms of red slicers, we have a lot of those of tomatoes in that category. And these are just some that have been coming to our attention as we process them. But we will have complete harvest data later this fall. So this is another tomato that Seed Revolution Now offers called Great Lakes, which I've never heard of before. And what Steve says on his website is that this is an old Michigan variety that he has seen do well in California, both on the cool coastal sites and the warmer inland sites, which is what the Willamette Valley is more like. And I've been really impressed. This is a photo of the harvest from Great Lakes in our trial. And it has all of the red slicers I'm talking about have little to no blossom end rot at this time of the season. What we've seen in our work with Early Girl in past years is that blossom end rot tends to get worse and worse as the plants have less and less moisture as the season progresses. So we don't know what's going to happen over the next month, but so far these are looking really great. Another one, which is from Adaptive Seeds, is called Spring King. And we had Dick Wadsworth, who is our most experienced dry farm tomato grower in the Valley. He has been dry farming for, I think, over 30 years, starting in California and then moving to Oregon. And he was out in the trail yesterday, and he just keyed right in onto Spring King and said, I want to grow that tomato. And he tasted it and he said, this is delicious. I love the flavor profile of it. And he wants us to help him figure out how to get somebody to grow him some Spring King plants. So everything that we've been talking about so far have been open pollinated, mostly older varieties. This is a new tomato bred by Vitalis, and it's a company that breeds for organic farming systems. And this is a hybrid called Frederick. And you can get the seeds from Johnny's Selected Seeds. And what they say, and this is kind of interesting, that it's an indeterminate tomato, but it has a short internode length, which is essentially what the dwarf tomatoes have. So it's a compact indeterminate plant and it has a lot of disease resistance in it. So this is the photo from Johnny's, and here's the photo from our harvest from yesterday. It's a really nice looking tomato. So paste tomatoes, we've been really interested in paste tomatoes because, as I mentioned earlier, because of the elongated shape of most paste tomatoes, they tend to get a lot of blossom end rot. And I've grown irrigated paste tomatoes and they've had like 100% blossom end rot on them. So I want to point out that we're finding quite a few that are performing really well. And here is at least a partial list of those. I actually have a bunch of them at home because this weekend I'm hoping to make them into sauce and try to see what I think about the different flavors of these tomatoes. But the amazing thing is that there's quite a few of these paste tomatoes in our trial that have very little blossom end rot. But the one that I wanted to talk about today, because it's a great local story and breeding project, is called Teardrop. And so I actually, before this trial, I hadn't been familiar with this tomato, but this was bred by Harry McCormack and Joe Farrell, whom I don't know. But Harry McCormack is from Sunbow Farm here. He's been a person who's been involved in the organic movement in Oregon since its very beginning. And this is what Harry told us about this tomato. And this is Teardrop here. Teardrop started out as a Heinz paste tomato that we brought on to Sunbow in the late 1980s. They did so well that they started saving seed from them. And then they thought, let's try to improve the flavor. So they crossed them with a Jim Baggett tomato variety. And Jim Baggett was the former tomato and vegetable breeder at Oregon State University, who bred a lot of tomatoes for at the time, much different climate here in Oregon, where it was much cooler and wetter. And so they crossed Oregon Spring with Heinz paste and then selected that material. And that became Teardrop, which is not very elongated, as you see. And it's a very firm tomato also. But what he said is that they just sold a lot of these. They had a cult following in Oregon, I guess, sort of before my time. And who knows, maybe through this project, we can bring this tomato back. And now I'm going to pass it off to Matt to talk about grafted tomatoes.
Hello, yep. So another part of the project, we're really interested in determining if we can improve tomato yields and reduce blossom end rot incidence using grafting. So here are a couple examples of some of the grafted tomatoes from our trial. On the left is Wisconsin 55, grafted onto Dro 141 Tex. And then on the right is early girl tomato grafted onto the rootstock Fortamino. So grafting was originally kind of developed as a method of conferring soil-borne disease resistance to tomato plants. This includes things like nematodes, which are these small microscopic roundworms, and other soil-borne bacteria and disease. And in this image, you can see on the slide on the left is a row of tomatoes that have not been grafted, and you can see they're very sick and wilty looking. And then on the right is a bunch of grafted tomatoes, and they're doing really well. So this is like technique that was developed not for dry farming, but for these disease resistance. However, it actually does confer, at least some rootstocks do confer a level of drought tolerance to tomato plants. This may be for a number of reasons. One of the reasons might be that it increases root growth. So there are more roots in the soil which are able to pull more water out of the soil. Another thing that the rootstocks might do is they might increase hydraulic conductivity. So that's how much water can move through the plant. The more hydraulic conductivity, the more water the plant can pull through it. It can also increase nutrient uptake by having a larger root area. It's able to pick up nutrients, and then those nutrients might be able to improve water use efficiency. So, by having more nitrogen in the plant, then the plant can actually create more carbohydrates per each unit of water it spends. And then the final reason that grafting might improve tomato yields and drought stress is that it can help create different bioactive chemicals in the plant. For example, this one aminocyclopropane, 1-carboxylic acid is apparently a precursor to ethylene. So these are all different ways that grafting might reduce drought stress in tomatoes. And in our research, we've actually found that it does indeed reduce drought stress. So here's a figure from last year. We went out and did these pre-dawn leaf water potential measurements. So that basically looks at how drought stressed the plant is. You go out before dawn, you take the leaves, you put them in this chamber, and you squeeze water out of them. And the more water is in the leaf, the faster the water gets squeezed out. So here on the bottom axis, you can see the planting density of the tomatoes. So from 10 square feet a plant, which is very tightly planted, all the way up to 60 square feet a plant on the right. And then on the axis on the left, you see pre-dawn leaf water potential. So the more negative the number, that -6 up there, means it's more drought stressed, whereas the -3 is less drought stressed. And then the different line colors are the different crop types. So the blue line is ungrafted, the red line is grafted, and you can see that the blue line is much higher. It's much more drought stressed than the red line. And we believe that this improved drought tolerance, that you get from grafting actually leads to less blossom end rot and more tomatoes that you can market. So here, this is from this year's work, August 17th, 2020. You can see on the left is that early girl that hasn't been grafted, lots of blossom end rot, small fruit. On the right is a early girl grafted onto Fortamino, which is one of our rootstocks. And you can see that there are lots of unblemished tomatoes and very little blossom end rot. And so we're actually looking at a bunch of different rootstocks to see if some of them perform better than others. So we have these trials at 2 different sites, one at Oregon State, the Vegetable Research Farm, and then the other at Gathering Together Farm. And we're looking at 5 different rootstocks, Fortamino, Xinjiang, Maxifort, Dro 141 Tex, and Imperador. And then we've grafted onto these rootstocks 6 different scions, so Early Girl, New Girl, Big Beef, Momotaro, Wisconsin 55, and BHN 871. So those are all commercial varieties of tomatoes that we're interested in. And through this research, we'll be able to determine which rootstocks actually, are better for dry farming. And it seems like we're already getting some early indication that some of them might be better than others. Here are some quick descriptions of some of the rootstocks. Fortamino was created for transplanting into stressful conditions, such as fields or unheated hoop houses. Xinjiang is really nice because it is really uniform in its germination and its shape. And that's one of the difficult things with grafting is you actually have to match the scion to the rootstock. And so for farmers, they really like uniform rootstocks that can easily be grafted. And then the final one, Dro 141 Tex, is that it puts more energy into the fruit and less energy into the leaves. So that might result in higher yields. Great.
All right, well, I just have right behind me here, I don't know if you can see this, 2 grafted tomatoes. This is a grafted big beef. And this is a grafted BHN 871, I think the number is. And I'm not entirely sure which rootstocks these were from, but they are amazing. So grafting, we do think that grafting has a lot of promise for dry farming of tomatoes. And we are working on that. So I just wanted to reiterate that, as we bring varieties along that seem promising, one of the things to understand from the beginning is that this is just a first year of data and it's only one site. So in our SARE project, what we do say is that we will do this, what I'm calling sort of preliminary screening primarily for blossom end rot resistance. Every year we'll bring in new germplasm to screen, things that look promising. And initially I thought, well, we'd get like 5 or 10 varieties that we might bring along, but at least thus far, and again, it's just going to get hotter and drier, so we could lose more varieties as we go, but nonetheless, there's a lot more varieties than I anticipated performing well. But so then what we need to do is grow them in different years. This spring was very unusual for Oregon in our new climate and weather. It was very wet this spring, so we got a lot of moisture in the soil after planting. So that's very different from other years where we haven't had any additional moisture after planting. So at any rate, the point being is that we need to try these out. We need to trial them in different years and also in different sites. So we'll continue to trial the promising ones, bring in new material, and also then the most promising ones we will trial on farmers' fields. And then the other piece of this is that also these varieties are just one piece in an overall management system. So one of the things that we're seeing with Early Girl is that you can stake them and that reduces blossom end rot. But a lot of farmers don't want to stake tomatoes, or they don't want to stake their dry farm tomatoes. And so another possibility is to find these more dwarfing plants, whether it's Frederick, this F1, or a dwarf tomato from the Dwarf Tomato Project, or some other, or a determinant variety that could be grown without staking. And then you still have to figure out planting density and fertility management. All of these things are part of developing a successful variety for dry farming. So the last thing I do want to mention is, flavor. One of the reasons why in California they grow Early Girl dry farm is because it's a really flavorful tomato. So one of the questions is, if Early Girl is not going to be the tomato that we grow, at least without grafting it, is dry farming enhancing the flavor of these other tomatoes, and do they taste good at all? So we are working with Lane Selman and the Culinary Breeding Network on this in this project. One of the things that's really important to understand about tomatoes is, while Early Girl is a really delicious tomato, some consumers probably don't like a dry farmed Early Girl tomato, because consumers have very, very different ideas of what their favorite tomato is. And there isn't a lot of academic data about this, but I was pointed in the direction of this paper, which is about consumer tomato preferences. And these consumers that were surveyed in this project were grocery store consumers, not farmers market consumers, but they were very diverse in their in their criteria for what a good tomato is. And so just to be brief, cluster 1 was driven by color and flavor, cluster 2 by firmness, cluster 3 by softness. So some people like firm tomatoes, some people like soft tomatoes. Other people like mild flavor like cluster 4, or they like really strong flavors, and that would be where a dry farm early girl would fall. So the point being is that there is no one perfect tomato. And so as we look at all these tomatoes, we're not going to be trying to find just one tomato to dry farm, but diverse tomatoes to dry farm, because people have diverse preferences. So what might we do? Sensory evaluation is a small piece of this overall project, but and we have to, especially in the times of COVID, it's going to limit our ability to have tastings like you see here in this photo. That's not going to happen anytime soon, but we can do other kinds of tastings or comparisons. So one of the things that we're thinking about is, for example, evaluating the flavor of a grafted variety and compare its flavor when it's not grafted to when it is grafted on different rootstocks. And we can both do taste testing and Brix testing. And then another possibility is that we would categorize these tomatoes into different types that consumers can relate to. Like, are they more acid or are they more mellow and sweet? What is their texture? Are they firm or are they soft? And do they have distinctive flavors? And I just want to say that, again, this is very preliminary. We're just in the middle of our first season of collecting data on all of this germplasm, and we'll have complete evaluation data later this fall. And we will be doing some webinars to share that information with you. And again, I just want to thank all of our partners in this project. And we can take questions now.
Great, thank you all for that presentation. I learned a lot. So far, we don't have any questions in the chat box. Maybe we'll allow folks just a couple minutes to see if any questions pop up here. And just a note too that the recording for this field tour will be available on our website that I posted there in the chat box for later viewing, or if you want to share it with anybody else that you think may be interested. And our next field tour will be next week, same time, same place. Well, we'll send there is registration required, but this will be on bean variety trials, and Lucas Niebert will be leading that field tour. So if anybody has interest in dry beans or tepary beans, we'll be highlighting those in next week's field tour.
Amy?
Yes.
Could I make a comment about early girl? I mean, we've found over the last 4 years of dry farming that there's many tomato varieties that are delicious dry farming. Early girl is by no means the only one. And that's why it's been so exciting to combine different varieties through hand pollination and then seeing what the subsequent generations do. For example, we've been using a tomato called Malachite Box, which is a yellowish green, incredibly soft tomato that's sort of a combination of lime and mango. And we've been using it, we've crossed it into a number of different things, including paste tomatoes, and giving the paste tomatoes a brighter flavor. And so we're really excited about the possibilities of just expanding this varietal list exponentially, and looking forward to the coming years, trying different stuff.
Yeah, and so that's great, Steve, and that's what we're hoping that we find in all, just screening varieties that we are screening. And then what we hope to do next is that promising material from Steve's work in California will come up to be trialed in Oregon, and vice versa.
So there is a question in the chat box here from Al LePage, and he's asking, have you considered companion planting or planting every few rows a different vegetable to see how that would affect yields or even blossom end rot?
We haven't considered that, and I think in the context of this project, we are growing so many things already that we probably wouldn't add that into our project, but it would be an interesting project for someone else.
And an interesting aside that's sort of related to that. So last year we did research where we dry farmed tomatoes and squash, and one of our blocks was right next to a squash row, and it actually had lower yields than the ones that were just next to a tomato. I think it might be because, you know, the squash was more competitive for water. I mean, I don't actually know, but it was sort of interesting as far as a result. You know,
Yeah,
not replicated by any means, but.
Companion planting is a complicated project, but it is a very interesting aspect of a farming system.
All right, we've got another question coming in here from Bonnie. She says, with the exception of Early Girl, are most of the varieties that so far have done well available for seed purchase, or are they still off the market?
So most of what we are growing is our commercial varieties, almost exclusively. I guess we have a few non-commercial varieties from the Oregon State University breeding program. And for example, Teardrop, I guess you can buy from Sunbow, but they're not really a seed company. So we'd have to figure out how to get that to people, but almost exclusively they are commercial varieties in our program. But Steve's is more breeding lines, although he has a seed company. But Steve, maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, a couple of them, like you mentioned, Great Lakes, yes, that's definitely available now, as well as the Brandywine Cherry. But I've got several others that aren't yet available. We're actually, because after the initial F1 cross, then we save seed and start looking at the subsequent generations, the F2s and F3s, and then they segregate, in the individual plants segregate into a lot of different kinds. So it's going to take a couple more years to kind of stabilize the ones that are really going to be the winners. But we will have every year now, I suspect, going forward, we're going to have several new ones available.
And the goal is, you know, Steve is actually doing breeding, but in the work actually in Oregon, it's not a breeding program. It's really just to identify commercial cultivars that are available right now. And that is, so we really want to get them out to people to grow.
We have another question here from Jason. He said, are they being grown or evaluated for harvestability?
That's a good question. So no, we have a profitability piece of this with Tanya Murray, who that's what she does full time, is work on profitability analysis for diverse organic vegetable farmers. And so in that part of it, we will address what I think possibly you're asking, which is, you know, is harvesting efficient? And maybe we could get clarification on that. But the point being is that we are also trying to look at, you know, is it profitable, and picking and labor is a huge part of that. And so varieties that we bring along, if they show real promise, hopefully through that profitability analysis piece, we would get at whether they're efficient to harvest, if that's the question.
Okay, we have one more question here from Al LePage, and he's asking this to you, Steve. What do you think of Dirty Girl, the variety Dirty Girl tomato?
I'm not really familiar with that one per se, but I'm actually working on another one called Atta Girl, which is part of that the Girl series. And it's showing real promise. It's larger than Early Girl, and also seems to be pretty resistant to blossom end rot. I can't really say anything about Dirty Girl because I haven't grown that one.
So we have Dirty Girl in our trial along with Yellow Girl and New Girl, and I think another girl that I can't think of right now.
Valley Girl?
Yeah, so at any rate, we have Dirty Girl in our trial, so we will have data on that by the end of the season. And I would just also like to say is that, you know, performance can be quite site specific. So even if we show that something is either really high performing in this particular year, in this particular place, or low performing, that doesn't mean that it couldn't be different in a different year in different place. I mean,
Okay, we have another question here. Are you planting the scion varieties ungrafted? If so, how are they performing in comparison?
So we are not finished with, we are. So in every case with the grafted plants, we grow the scion ungrafted, and then we have them grafted onto these various rootstocks. And so we will have data on their performance later. I would say, without having analyzed the data, that almost always the grafted plants perform better than the ungrafted. There is a difference in the different rootstocks, but we'll have very good data on that by the end of the season. But definitely grafting really helps yield and quality.
Any closing comments from any of our presenters? It looks like that's the end of the questions.
I'll just say one thing about, dry farming in general. And I know people say, well, you're going to take too much of a yield hit for it to be really commercial, except in very niche markets. And that's why people really focus on flavor and flavor characteristics as the sort of the marketing of it, because the yields are almost always less. However, I'm also working on sort of a middle way, and that's like low water. Like I would only apply one watering to the plants perhaps, which I think I would have done a lot better if I had this year with my warm site. So that's definitely an issue, is the yield, overall yields, and whether or not they're really commercially viable.
Well, and to add to that, one of the things that will come out, we hope, in the profitability analysis is that the inputs are lower. So it's not, yield is not the ultimate determination of success. It's whether or not you can make money growing that in comparison potentially to other crops, I guess. So irrigation is a big expense, and weed control is a big expense. And so if you can reduce those inputs costs, then you don't need as large a yield to make it pencil out. And so that's one of the things we'll explore in the profitability analysis. But also, we have tomatoes that are very high yielding. So, I mean, and that obviously is a goal. And it sort of depends on what your market is. Like for some farmers, ease of harvest and having no quality losses is more important than just a really big yield. So anyway, that's a complicated, question.
We do have a couple more questions/comments. One from Bonnie. It's unrelated to tomatoes, but she doesn't see a melon variety trial this year and wanted to see if we were dropping researching melons. And that's a funny question, because Alex was just talking to me yesterday or the day before about considering putting together a melon grant. So I think we were kind of maxed out for indeterminate crop harvest with all the tomatoes this year. So we do have a couple rows of melons out there in our fields, but just didn't have the capacity with all the other projects to closely examine melons on the same level that Alex is examining tomatoes. But Christmas watermelon and Eel River are both ones that we've got from Steve and continue to do well. But perhaps we're going to continue those, and maybe consider putting in a grant for those, Bonnie. We've got some thank yous, and is there any other questions before we end this for the day? Just a quick note here, we will be sending up a follow-up email with the recording once it's uploaded onto our website, so you can share that if you'd like. And there'll also be an evaluation that we'll send out along with that. So if there's no other questions, thanks, Kathy. She said she's appreciative of everyone's work on this. It's a pleasure to work with everybody on this. There's a great team of people and all the farmer collaborators. I think that everybody's grateful to be working on this together. So, all right. Have a great day, everybody.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.